This morning we're going to talk about gospel leadership. Last week, Robert kind of went over gospel invitation and preaching and all of that stuff. I told him on Thursday that I was happy that somebody other than me was talking about preaching because I probably would have just been all over the place and said way too much. He did a great job. I told him, I was like, I did listen, not to critique, but just, I was curious, and I think he knocked it out of the park. So thank you. I don't believe that it was the first time that you've taught in front of people. Even though I know that's true, you did a great job. So thanks. All right, let's turn in our Bibles to Mark 10. Mark 10. Let's see if green works today. Mark, I do not like how that looks. We will not use green. Let's go with black. Mark 10. Mark 10, verse 42 to 43. And I'm going to grab my Bible from up here. Does somebody want to read that very loud for us? Very loud. Who's the loudest person here? Steve. All right, Steve, be nice and loud. Go for it.
What verses were they?
Mark 10, verse 42 to 43.
Jesus called them to him and said to them, "You know that those who are considered rulers of the Gentiles lord it over them, and their great ones exercise authority over them. But it shall not be so among you. But whoever would be great among you must be your servant." How far?
That's it?
That's it.
Yep. Perfect. So this statement here is actually one of the most significant statements in the Bible on leadership. Because Jesus starts with an observation, right? He's saying people around in the world lead in a certain way, right? By doing what? What do you see in verse 42? They lord it over them. Exactly. So they lord it over them, right? This is our default setting. If you have any kind of power, we just, by default, exert that power over people, even if it's the smallest little power in the world, right? That's just the default. We want to just put people in their place, pull rank, dominate, rule, and Jesus is basically like, you guys know this. This is how people operate. And so no matter who it is, like people with any amount of power will find a way to assert it over other people who lack it. And Jesus says, it shall not be so among you. It shall not be so among you. Right? He's like, you are called to be fundamentally different. Or in other words, he's saying, lording your power over people has no place in the kingdom. That's not how I operate. That's not how my people operate. And so if you want to be great in the kingdom, it's not by your power or your prowess or your rule, but actually by service. Because he says at the end, he says, whoever must be great among you must be your servant. Now, what's the context of all of this? Have you guys read Mark recently? Or if you just want to scan up and see, what's the context of this? Who is he talking to? James and John, right? So James and John, they keep hearing Jesus tell about his death, his resurrection, the kingdom, everything that's coming. And so they say to him, I think in Mark's gospel, they come to him. And in Luke's gospel, I think they send their mom to come to him and make this request, right? They're like, hey, verse 35, right? We want you to do what we are going to ask of you. That's what they're saying to Jesus. Now, and before we look down on them and go, what a bunch of idiots, right? Give them the Peter treatment that we're like, oh, there they go again, opening their big yaps. Are we really that different? Are we that different? I mean, even as a pastor, we have the propensity or the proclivity to go, this is what I want for my church, therefore I'm going to approach God or see God as a means to accomplish whatever I want. Again, that's just the default leaning of our heart. And so then in verse 37, James and John, they said, grant us to sit one at your right hand and one at your left hand. They kind of missed the whole death, resurrection type stuff, but they did believe that Jesus would rule. They knew that he would rule in his kingdom, and so they basically said, hey, can we have the two greatest seats of honor in your kingdom? can we have the two greatest seats of honor in your kingdom? In essence, I guess in today's culture, if you think about the presidential race and stuff, right, as you pick a running mate and you have a cabinet, I mean, we want to be your top 2 cabinet members. We want to be the people right there all the time. And so their plan was basically, hey, we're going to come to Jesus and he's going to make us great. He's going to make us great. And again, I think we can very easily fall into this trap because we revert under that mentality that if we want to be great, we want to be something, we even want like a legacy, right? We want to set our kids up well. We want to be thought of well. We want to do something that matters and lasts. And so we do that by saying, well, I'm going to have my way. I'm going to exert my power. And if I have to use Jesus to do so, it's almost like we just baptize our selfishness, right, by coming to Jesus to accomplish our agendas. Now, what's fascinating is if you look back to the Old Testament, you don't need to flip there, but if you want to, 1 Samuel 8, I'm going to flip there. So if you do want to flip there, I'll give you a second. But in 1 Samuel 8, if you remember the story of Israel, right, they were, obviously we did Genesis, we studied Genesis for a couple years as a church. After that, they end up in Egypt. After Egypt, they're wandering around in the wilderness, in the promise, and then they get to the promised land, and God kind of says like, hey, you guys are going to be different. You're going to be a different country, and through you, all the nations of the earth will be blessed. And so God gave them judges when they kept sinning, but he had priests, and that was kind of he had these tribes and the leaders and priests, and eventually sent judges, and they were like, no, we want a king. Right? We want a king. We want to be like the other nations. He says in 1 Samuel 8, verse 5, is when they basically are like, we want a king to judge us, and they say, like the other nations. And God told Samuel 2 verses later, in verse 7, he said, they have rejected me from being the king over them. They want their own human kings. Right? I mean, and what's fascinating about that is God saying, by wanting to have this earthly, Gentile-like rule, you want to be like all the other nations, that's not just unwise, but it's actually, it's spiritual rebellion, right? It's you're rejecting God as the king. And so God said, fine, I'm going to give you guys what you want, but I'm going to warn you, all right? Let me read verse 11 and on. This is what he said. He said, these will be the ways of the kings who will reign over you. I want you to notice what verb comes up over and over and over again when I read this. He will take your sons and appoint them to his chariots and to be his horsemen and run before his chariots. He will appoint them for himself, the commanders of thousands of commanders of 50s, and some to plow his grounds and reap harvests, and to make judgments of war and equip the chariots. He will take your daughters to be perfumers and cooks and bakers. He will take the best of your fields and vineyards and olive orchards and give them to his servants. He will take 1/10 of your grain and of your vineyards and give it to his officers and servants. He will take your male servants and female servants and the best of your young men and your donkeys and put them to his work. He will take 1/10 of your flock, and you shall be his slaves. And in that day you will cry out to your king, or cry out because of your king, whom you have chosen for yourself, but the Lord will not answer you in that day. What verb comes up over and over and over again of what the king will do to them? Take. He will take. He will take and take and take and take. And that's what human, sinful, Gentile, what Jesus talks about, Gentile leadership does. It takes and takes and takes. And people end up enslaved and crying out, going, why in the world did we even ask for this in the first place? Why did we ask for that? And after generations of leaders lording it over them, God eventually rebukes them. He makes good on his promise here at the end when he says, you're going to cry out and I'm not going to answer you, right? And in Ezekiel 34, God calls out all of these wicked kings and wicked rulers for what they've been doing, right? They were feeding and clothing themselves. They were taking all they could from the people, and they were ultimately destroying the people. And so God says, those are the evil things that they were doing, but they also weren't being faithful. What are things that they weren't doing? They did not strengthen you. They did not heal you. They did not bind up the broken. They did not seek the lost and the strayed. And so these leaders, they weren't just negligent leaders, they were destructive leaders. They were destructive leaders, and it left God's people scattered, lost, injured, and starved. And what's the verdict that God says? He says, I am against the shepherds. I mean, that's like, whew. I'm against the rulers. I'm against these wicked kings who are lording it over you. And God says, I'm going to put up with your failed leadership no more. See, leadership that takes is an ever-present danger. And the leaders of Ezekiel's day, which have been indicative really ever since 1 Samuel 8, with the first king Saul, they exploited the people of God. King Saul took for himself. All of these leaders took for themselves, and it led to their destruction. And James and John are no different, right? They're heading in the same direction. They asked for prominence and power over other people. Why? Because of what they wanted to get out of it. And that's where I'm like, okay, well, if that's an issue of Israel in the Old Testament, and it kind of carries on, and then it shows up in James and John, I'm like, we're not that different. Especially if this is the default leaning of nations in general and rulers in general. I mean, we ask for prominence and ask for power all the time, and even in a Christian way. Again, we do this in churches. I mean, we see in the news all the time, right? We see pastors being domineering and totally destroying the churches that God's put them in. But it's not just a thing of mega churches, right? It exists in smaller churches too. They just don't make the news. Because lording over people is a heart issue for every single leader and every single person, right? And so when we think of the church, it's a lot of things, right? It's an edifice, right? It requires systems, rosters, programs. It's a body. It's a complex whole made up of a diversity of parts, all making unique contributions and gifts. It's a family. It's highly relational. Like there is not a lack of or a shortage of analogies of what the people of God are in the Bible. And so you're like, all right, that's a lot. It's very hard to lead, right? I mean, I basically spent all last week with another pastor in the Pittsburgh area just working on leadership stuff. And I'm like, I feel like I've got hit by a semi-truck and I'm just starting to scratch the tip of the iceberg of what it is to lead well, right? But a lot of pastors and a lot of leaders even, we can just drift into adopting models of leadership from our surrounding culture, right? And I'm not saying we just say, well, there's nothing good out there. We only need to stay with Christian authors. I mean, we can learn from, you can read history. I know Steve's a big history buff. Like, you can learn from Churchill. You can learn from what good leaders do. And there's wise principles, but we need to be careful because Jesus' observation here is the rulers of the Gentiles in Mark 10. There's a lot of good things we can learn from other people, but there is an underlying assumption and philosophy among fallen people that we need to avoid. And that's why Jesus says, it shall not be so among you. Meaning, there must be a clear distinction between how leaders lead in the church as people of God and how people who don't know God rule their businesses, right? Or lead their countries, or even lead their families. There needs to be a clear distinction between godly leadership and just natural human leadership. I mean, we've all seen bad examples, right? Now, I know this isn't as common in predominantly white churches, but there is a philosophy in church that the pastor and the first lady, right? Have you guys heard of this before? And there's a first family, and they're kind of given special treatment and just like, well, whatever they say goes. But it's hard, and I think obviously there's a lot of passages on what pastors are to be and how they're supposed to be servants and how suffering for the gospel, like that makes it hard to kind of reconcile that style of like, oh, well, we're just going to lay out the red carpet and worship the ground you walk on, and then being a biblical leader, right? But I think something probably a little closer to home that a lot of us are familiar with is a pastor is CEO, right? A pastor is CEO. And so success is measured numerically. It's very results-oriented. People look more probably to a pastor's competency than their character. Well, that's just a horribly run church. I'm like, well, okay, but are they being biblical? I mean, because you can grow in your leadership. That's a way easier fix than somebody who is domineering, right? I mean, I say this all the time. When you think of the way that Paul lays out the qualifications for an elder, it's all character except for one competency. And the one competency is able to teach, which is important, right? All the other ones are character. All the other ones are character. And so it's important, like, if you guys, I don't know, let's say I get hit by a bus today. I don't hope that happens. And you guys hire a pastor and go, oh man, he's a great leader. He's very dynamic, very visionary. He's a great kind of CEO. I mean, what that leads to then is running the church like a business. And if you're successful, you, get puffed up with pride. And you get arrogant. You have this kind of swagger. And then what happens is, well, we don't love these things about the pastor. He's a little short with people. He's a little this or that or whatever. But, I mean, look at how we've grown. Look at the results. Look at the numbers. The proof's in the pudding. You can't argue with the results. You can't argue with what's happening here. And then you just don't question these leaders. And so one other model, which I'll just address, and then we'll move on. One other model is just the pastor as a general, right? It's I strategically know where to put the people in their places where they can thrive, right? I know the battle plan. I know where everyone fits in. But again, having a very stoic, kind of emotionally disengaged interaction with people where we're putting people in their place, in the right place, under the guise of, keeping them humble. Well, you're not actually this. You need to be here, right? I mean, when a pastor says, oh, we need to humble them, I'm like, just call time out, okay? If any leader is like, oh, we really need to humble them. I mean, that is the exact opposite of what Jesus is getting at in Mark 10. If you think of a leader that says we need to put someone in their place, the place that Jesus would say is above us, not under us, right? We need to put people, if you want to put someone in their place, do what Jesus did. He never put anyone in their place under them. He always elevated them and put their needs and their dignity before himself. I mean, again, if you read all the one another's in the Bible, none of them say, humble one another. I mean, the only person we are called to humble is ourselves. Humble yourselves under the mighty hand of God, is what 1 Peter 5 says. So let's actually turn to 1 Peter 5. I think this is my last passage for us today. But 1 Peter 5 is where kind of Peter is writing to these churches about pastoring and shepherding. Let me read 1 Peter 5, the first 3 verses. He says, I exhort the elders among you as a fellow elder and a witness of the sufferings of Christ, as well as a partaker in the glory that is to be revealed. Shepherd the flock of God that is among you, exercising oversight, not under compulsion, but willingly, as God would have you, not for shameful gain, but eagerly, not domineering over those in your charge, but being examples to the flock. All right? I want you to notice 3 contrasts about what he says is a work of a pastor, which I think just applies leadership in general. All right, so willing. So let's say good. We have our good category and our bad category. All right? So willing, he says willing, not coercive. Maybe? Is that how I spell it? Coercive? Sure. Coercive, right? Serve. Bad. Greedy. And then lead by example. Compulsion. All right. So I don't think I needed to write good and bad, because if you look at those 2 lists, I mean, which leader would you rather operate under? Right? Which leader would you rather operate under? I mean, they all kind of go together, but really what Jesus is talking about here, I think this kind of sums up what Jesus is talking about here. Be an example, right? You lead by example, not by compulsion. I mean, because it is possible to dominate other people, right, with intimidation, coercion, threats, bullying, guilt, whatever it is. And then what happens is then if a pastor does that, then the church just goes along and they assent to following by compulsion. And so they lead under this weird domineering guilt and compulsion, not led by the Spirit. They're not led by the Spirit. And what Peter goes on to say is that domineering can be a form of shameful gain, right? So greed is not just money, but you can be greedy for power. You can be greedy for prominence. You can be greedy for influence. You can be greedy just for control. And so if the pastor is to lead willingly, then that also means the flock is to lead willingly. So if I'm like, hey, we're going to do this, and you guys are like, what do I do then? Do I go, well, I'm going to strong arm you into that? Or I'm going to say, hey, let me show you actually why this is a thing we should be doing. Let me show you by example, by serving you guys, why we should be doing that. And let me say this, though. People have looked at our church structure and they have said, how do you guys get anything done? Right? It's slow. Because this is like, this works in the business world. It does. It gives really, really, really good results really, really fast. But it leads to burnout, right? It leads to frustration. It leads to everyone looking over their shoulder, not knowing who's going to attack them. And I mean, it ultimately just drives people crazy. This takes a lot of time. You got to build trust. You got to build relationships. But if we're talking about what we've been talking about here, if you have that, what we've talked about in the first couple of chapters, that place of safety, that place of comfort, that place of support, then you're like, man, I would rather do this and play the long game than do that. I heard a pastor on a podcast a couple months ago, I was listening, and he said the older and older he's got, he's kind of just said, you know what? He hears all the younger pastors in his church go, man, we need to fix that. We need to jump on that. We need to do this. We need to do that. And obviously, like Paul told Timothy, who was a young pastor, don't be hasty in the laying on of hands, but I think just don't be hasty is a great principle, period. Because as young people, I'll speak for myself, I'm 32. I've been in pastoral ministry for about 10-ish years. It is I'm like, I want to fix this. I want to fix this. I want to fix this. And hearing older pastors go, give that person some time. Let the Lord work on them. Just love them faithfully. Play the long game. Now, don't like skirt around stuff. Don't not address things. But like, be willing not to have overnight success, right? Because Christians grow as plants. Jesus used a lot of agrarian analogies. Plants do not grow overnight. They don't. They take a lot of tending and a lot of time, and season after season, if you're doing it right, it gets better and produces more fruit. All right, let me get back to here. Let's see. In Romans 14, Paul talks about like the whole church as like he's explaining kind of how they can interact with each other, right? You have those who are weak in the faith, and they abstain from certain foods or practices or whatever, even though God says, hey, you don't need to abstain. You're allowed to eat pork, right? You're allowed to go on a walk on Sundays. That's totally fine. But they're like, I don't know, my conscience won't let me do it. And so what Paul tells the people who understand their freedoms in Christ is that these weaker brothers should not be coerced into changing their practices. You shouldn't sit down and argue with them on why they should go on a walk with you on Sundays, right? That's not what he says. Look at what he says in Romans 14, verse 23. He says, whoever has doubts is condemned if he eats, if he goes against his conscience. Because the eating is not from faith, for whatever does not proceed from faith is sin. That principle right there, whatever does not proceed from faith is sin, is so helpful, right? Because if we have people in our church who have a different view on one of those tertiary issues, right? I'm not talking about gospel truths here. I'm talking about things like religious liberty or Christian liberties, right? How we approach, like, what does the Lord's Day / Sabbath thing actually look like? How do we, not in drunkenness, but how do we moderately, do we interact with alcohol, those type of things? How do we school our kids? Do we spank our kids or not? How do we vote? How do we, like, all of those things that do not put you outside of the faith, but we can disagree on and exist in the same church, even as we're going through Revelation, even our end times stuff. Again, not denying Jesus is coming back. Like, I'm not saying that, but I'm like, is there a rapture? Do we get zapped up before? Or do we stay through it all? Are we in the millennium? Is it coming? Has it like all of those questions? If people have something different than us, if we coerce them to go along with whatever we're saying, I mean, we're leading them into sin. If somebody says, actually, I'm going to abstain from alcohol, and you go, dude, you can have a beer. You can have a glass of wine. And then they do, and they go against their conscience, even though they're not drunk. What Paul's saying here is, you just led them into sin. You just led them to go against their conscience. It's not then the Spirit of Christ who's leading them, but it's the forcefulness of man. And when a believer is led by man instead of the Lord, like, we know how catastrophic that is, right? So we can, just getting someone to go along with your kind of way about doing things, coercing them into that, will damage their conscience and their relationship with the Lord. And so what does Jesus tell James and John? Let's go back to Mark 10. Let's go back to Mark 10. Let me read verse 43 to 45. It shall not be so among you. Whoever would be great among you must be your servant. Whoever would be first among you must be slave to all. For even the Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve and give his life as a ransom for many. So Jesus is saying here, if you want to be great, it is not measured by how many people are under you, but it's actually in how many people you regard above you, greater than you, how many people you put yourself under and serve them. And what's fascinating about this, just step back and think, who is the one person that is actually able to put themselves over anyone? Jesus, right? And he's talking here. And he's saying, I'm not even doing that. And so we, who are far less worthy than Jesus, should have all the more reason to take the role of a servant if that's what Christ did for us. And if we put ourselves over people or put people under us, not only are we risking putting ourselves over them, but we're also risking putting ourselves over Jesus, saying, well, I know Jesus served, but that's beneath me. I mean, that's the reality of what Jesus is saying here, right? And when we do so, not only will God remove us like he does with the leaders in Ezekiel's day, but if you keep reading on in Ezekiel 34, he actually says, yeah, not only am I just going to do away with all of your kings because they're terrible shepherds, I'm just going to step in and do it myself. And that's actually, when you think about it, if you think about just the beautiful patience of God and even his loving discipline, God was willing to give them what they asked for, even though he knew that it would not be good. But he's like, yeah, you guys are going to come to the end of yourself in this one, and then I'm going to step in the greatest act ever. I mean, in Ezekiel 34, he promises them. He doesn't say, I'm going to give you a better system than a monarchy. He says, what you guys actually need, not a better system, but a better shepherd. You need a better shepherd, and I will do that personally because he calls them his sheep. That's what's fascinating. He says he'll gather them, he'll care for them, he'll provide justice for them. He will be the leader that they need, that all these other kings are failing to do. And ultimately, we know that that's fulfilled in Jesus, right? He's the good shepherd of Ezekiel 34. I mean, Jesus says that in John's gospel. I am the good shepherd. And his presence as the perfect leader of God's people is the answer for all of the terrible leadership that we fall ourselves into. Like, this is Jesus. If this is the natural inclination of our hearts, look at how Jesus serves. Look at how he leads us. And so as we look to Jesus, the Good Shepherd, we see three foundational truths. I'll write this on the board. These are kind of pulled from all of the different passages that we have covered this morning. I'll end with this, and then if you want to ask some questions or whatever, we can do all that. The first one is this. The sheep are God's. The sheep are God's, right? I mean, in Ezekiel, Jesus goes from talking about the sheep to my sheep. These are his sheep. I mean, those under my leadership here, like the members of this church, are not my members. This is not my church as a pastor, right? As a member, I'm like, yeah, for sure, this is my church. But remember, like, pastors are not given churches. Churches are given pastors. Yes? You guys tracking with me? Everyone's just kind of staring. All right. Okay, that's why I always say, like, yes, what's your question?
I just think sheep belong.
They belong to God.
If I read that, if I just came in the building and read that, I would think you're saying that sheep are God's.
Oh, no, sorry. Yeah, that's the apostrophe. Sheep are not like gods. Yeah, sheep belong to God, right? The sheep are possessed not by pastors or leaders, but by God. They belong to God. They're possessed by, not possessed, owned, purchased, right? I mean, each of you guys need to see yourselves. Your identity is not a member of Michael's church. It's a member of Christ. You are a member of the family of God, a member of God's church, right? Does that make sense? He is the head, right? He is the head, and we are his body, right? I mean, Paul goes so far, like when he charges the Ephesian elders, and even what we saw in 1 Peter 5, he says, shepherd the flock of God among you. That's wild, right? That's not, hey, shepherd your flocks. How's your church? Well, like I always try to keep coming back to, these are God's people, not mine. Because here's the thing, like Jesus died for the sheep. I didn't die for anyone. And so it's so precious, like the people of God are so precious that Jesus would lay his life down, bleed, and die for them. Purchase them with his blood. All right, number 2, that's just a foundational one, okay? Pastors are, let me see if I can fit all this in here. Pastors are under shepherds. All right? Pastors are under shepherds. The idea comes from 1 Peter 5. We were just getting into it. 1 Timothy 5. He says, shepherd the flock of God that's among you. And then in verse 4, he says, and when the chief shepherd appears, right? That's Jesus. Okay? So if we are being good, godly leaders, we are basically just standing there extending the shepherding of God, serving under the real shepherd, right? Serving under the real shepherd. And here's the thing that is actually very comforting for me. Because I don't own anyone, and because Christ is the chief shepherd, I can if I drop the ball, it's okay. I'm not saying I'm going to try to drop the ball. But these realities free me up immensely. It helps me be able to fall asleep on Sunday night instead of getting lost in the continual loop of all the things I didn't do right this week or this morning. And I can actually lay down and go, I can rest because God doesn't rest. And I can depend on him to care for his people because I am merely an under shepherd. All right, let me keep moving on. And then the third thing is that pastors are sheep, right? Yes, we are under shepherds, but we're also sheep. Like I always say, I am a member here first. I'm a member here first, and I would probably argue, we can get into this conversation later if you want, I probably have more of an important role and more authority as a member than I do as a pastor. Like, we are sheep, and we need like I am a member of this church, and I need Jesus to lead me more than I need to lead you guys. Right? And that is so key to understand. And again, what that should do is not put me on a pedestal, but it should actually go, oh, he's just one of us who happens to be gifted in leading and teaching. And so we're going to follow him insofar as he follows the Bible with that. But at the end of the day, if I'm leading and I'm domineering and I'm trying to accomplish all these things and my heart's not at a right place, that's not good. And you guys should not just go, hey, Michael, you're wrong, but also you should care deeply for my soul that I would be in a healthy place, not just to lead the church. I mean, I remember praying this last week. I'm up in Pennsylvania, and I'm praying, and I'm just like, God, I don't know why I feel like if I'm not a great pastor or husband or father, why I feel like I fail you. I know it doesn't matter. And I know that if the more I'm found in my identity in you, the better pastor, husband, father I will be. But we know, like, when God looks at me, I do not need to be a pastor to be his. And not even like I need to be the best pastor in the world. I don't need to be a husband to be his. I don't need to be a dad to be his. In the grand scheme of eternity, those three roles, as important as they are in my day-to-day life here and now, they don't really matter in eternity. The role that matters in eternity is that I am Christ's. I'm his. I mean, I think that's what I need. I know a lot of this on leadership, so a lot of this is falling on me, but I'm like, if I'm trying to find my identity in all of those other roles that are not going to last for eternity, and I miss the one thing that matters, I mean, that would be the biggest mistake of my entire life. All right? I don't really know where I was going to end with all that. Do we have any questions on this? If you guys don't have questions, there's just an idea I'll throw out, but any questions on this at all? Yes, Josh.
So how do we find a good balance between we are under shepherds, we are not ultimately responsible, but then these roles have definite, like, built-in responsibilities?
Correct.
How do we find a good balance between, yes, this is my responsibility, but ultimately, I can't.
Yes. There's a really good book. I can let you borrow it if you want. Jonathan Leeman just wrote a book on authority, which is really fascinating. And he talks about the two different types of authority in Scripture are the authority of counsel and the authority of, now I'm blanking on it. What is it? The authority of what? No, not coercion. No, in like good biblical, it's basically like the authority of command. That's what it is, command and counsel, right? And so there's three types of authority that have command, and all of them have a way to enforce that authority, right? Parents over their children, they have the rod, right? The state over the people, they have the sword. And the church over believers, they have the keys, right? So those are the three that if you go outside of these things, these are the methods by which we correct you, right? So that's the authority of command. Now there's authority of counsel, which would be like pastors, but at the end of the day, if a church doesn't do what pastors do, there's nothing in the Bible for like, okay, pastors, then do blank, right? In fact, the opposite is true. It's if the pastors aren't doing what the church wants to do, then the church is to use those keys and exercise discipline over them, right? We think of like a husband and wife. Like the husband has authority in the house, but it is authority of counsel, not authority of command, right? Does that kind of make sense? And so as I think of myself as a pastor in a church, much like in a marriage relationship where there is authority that we are to lead in certain ways, but at the end of the day, it's like it's not ultimately our authority, it's really the church's, which is why I said earlier, I think that I have more authority and more responsibility as a member here than as a pastor, because a member here is like, that's my part of the body, and then like that is me being a part of the body, and me being a pastor is my role and my function in what I do here. Does that kind of answer what you're asking a little bit?
Yeah, I think it was more kind of we see in Scripture like the elders are worthy of a double honor, but will also be judged in departure for strictness. Like
For sure.
there's that sense of you want to take your responsibility seriously.
Oh, yeah.
So then that balancing that, I guess, with this idea that it's ultimately God's responsibility, and yet I still have to take my responsibility seriously.
For sure. Yeah, because elders will be like, I mean, and that's what in, I think it's Hebrews, where Luke, well, the unknown author, I'm just kidding. I think it's Luke, I don't know. But where the author is telling the members, like, hey, follow your pastors, follow your leaders. They will give an account for how they led you. Now, ultimately, that's not heaven or hell, but we will answer to the Lord for how we lead people. And so there is an extra level of authority there. And we should, but again, I think that's we as pastors need to walk in a way as an example, as a servant leader, showing people, hey, this is what following Jesus looks like. And if you're putting the best servant leaders in the places of leadership, then what that does is then all of the church kind of comes along under you. But what's fascinating about back in the day, shepherds actually led the flock from the back. You know who led the flock from the front? The butcher, right? And so it's really like I'm trying to get behind you guys, trying to go, hey, let's all do this together, not like, let's storm and follow me, and I'm just going to coerce you along the way. All right? Yes?
There's an example in Galatians 4.
Okay. Galatians 4.
Paul is talking about be like I treat you to become as I am also I have become as you are. So he's treating them to be like he is in Christ.
Correct.
But he's coming into a situation where they have been duped by other teaching, and so he's trying to get them back.
Right.
But he's not doing it as a command, he's doing it relationally.
Yes. Yes. And again, that's where like I think the best leadership is by example, right? And that's why Paul elsewhere says, imitate me as I imitate Christ. He doesn't just say, do everything I do, but he says, imitate me as I imitate Christ. And so insofar as I am following Christ, you guys should follow me. So, all right, any other questions or thoughts? I was going to get into the whole kind of like, how do we lead out of the care for people and not push them, but then how do we not turn that into spiritualizing laziness? But I can save that soapbox and rant for another day.